Hi everyone, Susan Storm here, and I am joined by Denzel Mensa. If you're new to our streams, I am the founder and primary writer for psychologyjunkie.com, where you can find over 1,000 blog articles on the Myers-Briggs personality types and the Enneagram types. Denzel, could you introduce people to yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Denzel Mensa. I'm an ENFJ 911, social sexual Enneagram subtypes. I'm a life personal development and relationship coach. Yeah, you can find me on YouTube as well underneath Denzel Mensa. I just like to talk about a lot of conceptual things, a lot of things about typology, and anything having to do with relationships, bettering them, whether it be on a one-on-one scale or on a societal global scale. So yeah, that's really like where I really like to hang out at.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, you should definitely check out Denzel's channel too while you're here. If you get done with this and you want to see more about what he does, I will be posting a link in the description later. If you're here and you want to say hi, go ahead and drop us a comment. Give us some love to show that we're actually can hear us and that we're actually communicating. We always want these live presentations to be interactive. We want to hear your thoughts, your questions. And so if you're here and you've got something to say, let us know in the comments because we want to address your issues because sometimes typology can be confusing and we want to make it less confusing for everyone. Hi, Rigel. I hope I'm not pronouncing that wrong. And you say you found practical value in learning personality theory. I appreciate that. That was what I loved about personality type when I first started getting into it. I thought, this is so practical. This will help me in so many ways with people and with just organizing my relationships with people. Hi, Katja. Nice to see you again. I think this is the third or fourth stream we've had you, and now I feel like I know you. So thanks for joining up. All right. Well, as usual, I'll just go ahead and dive right into the presentation. Today, we're starting a whole new series because we got done with cognitive functions last week. We went through all 8 of the functions, and now we're starting something totally different. We're going to be diving into cognitive function placements. Like, what does the dominant function mean? What does inferior function mean? And eventually, we'll get into the shadow functions. Because a lot of times, when people are new to type, they start reading about it or they start watching videos about it, and people are throwing around all these words and all this jargon that they don't know. And it can be a little exhausting and overwhelming at first. So if you're not sure what the dominant function is, or even what a function stack is, or anything like that, this is the place for you. Or if you know what it is, but you just want to have a more deep understanding of it, then this is also the place for you. Or if you want to ask questions about it, then this is the place for you. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my presentation on the dominant function. We're also going to be doing just a brief overview of what cognitive functions are and what a function stack is so that we've got the basics covered. All right, so cognitive functions. So what we just talked about over the last couple of months. These are mental processes that you use to perceive information and prioritize decisions. There are 4 basic functions: thinking, feeling, sensing, and intuition. And each function has an attitude, either an introverted attitude or an extroverted attitude, which results in what we call this huge list of 8 different functions: extroverted thinking or introverted thinking, extroverted feeling or introverted feeling. So whether you're a sensor, intuitive thinker, or feeler, your type of feeling, thinking, sensing, or intuition will have a specific attitude based on your personality type. So when you hear people using terms like TISINE, all these things like that, they are referring to these cognitive functions. And what happens is they capitalize the function. So T for thinking, F for feeling, N for intuition, S for sensing. And then they use a lowercase I or E to determine the attitude of that function. So if you hear someone saying, oh, I'm an NI Dom, that would mean they have introverted intuition as their dominant function. So now if you just like copy and pasted this slide, then you can follow along with all those people who are talking about type, who've been talking about it for a long time and are throwing out all these terms that you maybe don't know. I know when I first got into type, I was like, what is everyone talking about? So, all right, so what does it mean to have a cognitive function that is introverted in attitude? So an introverted function means that it's directed at the inner world. And this is a quote from Carl Jung. He is kind of the father of psychological type. He said, the introvert's attitude is an abstracting one. He is always intent on withdrawing libido from the object as though he had to prevent the object from gaining power over him. And this quote in and of itself might be a little bit confusing. Like a lot of times you think of libido as like something sexual. What he means by libido is something like withdrawing energy, passion, focus on the object. And by the object, he means the external world or the things going on around the self. So the introvert it feels exhausted by pouring energy into the external world too much. They have this feeling like they might be overwhelmed by the external world. And so they keep a lot of their energy focused inward. Extroverted functions are directed at the external world. Carl Jung says, the extrovert has a positive relation to the object. He affirms its importance to such an extent that his subjective attitude is constantly related to and oriented by the object. So extroverts are focused more on the world outside themselves, the world around them. That's what he means by the object. And so the libido, energy, focus, passion is primarily directed externally. And then that affects the inner attitude. It's constantly influenced by the energy being focused outward. I'll just pop over to Denzel for a minute before I keep going on. Any thoughts on this before we keep moving on, Denzel?
I think we can keep on moving on for now.
Okay, you just let me know because sometimes I feel like I'm dominating everything.
No,
but we're talking
good.
about the dominant function, so I guess that would be apropos. All right, so here's a lot of what you'll see online about a cognitive function stack. It'll look something like this. So here we've got ENFJ, cognitive function stack. And you can see there's the conscious and the unconscious down here. And this is the primary function stack. We're not getting into shadow functions yet because that would just be way too deep and we'd end up losing people. It's best to start here. So ENFJs, their dominant function is extroverted feeling. FE, auxiliary is introverted intuition. Tertiary is extroverted sensing, and inferior is introverted thinking. And you can see that the dominant function, the two extroverted functions are pointing this way. We'll just call this side over here the extroverted world, and then this side the introverted world. And the dominant function is the biggest one. It doesn't mean that this function is actually bigger or more powerful than all the other functions. We'll get into what it means in the next few slides. Now, another model for the cognitive functions that I like to use is John Beebe's model. And he talks about, he calls the functions hero instead of dominant, mother, father instead of auxiliary, eternal child instead of tertiary, and animus instead of inferior. And so if you are an ENFJ, then your hero, your dominant function is extroverted feeling, and your inferior function is introverted thinking, at the animus. And this makes up the spine of your personality type. The arms of the ENFJ personality type would be introverted intuition for the mother, father, and extroverted sensing for the eternal child. So these are two different ways of looking at the cognitive functions, and you might see both of these online. They're both accurate, but they're just different ways of grouping them. And then this is shadow functions. I might even just skip over this slide because we might get into that later, and that might just overly confuse things. All right, so what is the spine of the personality? I think this part's important. So the spine of the personality, I showed it back here. That's the dominant and inferior function, the hero and the animus. The development of the spine of the personality creates the core of self. That's our innate personality. And so it's really important. A lot of people, they focus a lot on the dominant function. And I've even heard some people go so far as to say, like, don't worry about the inferior function. Don't really delve into that too much because you're just going to overwhelm yourself. But it's actually important to have a healthy spine of your personality. And Mark Hunziker, who's the author of Depth Typology, which is a book I'm always recommending, has this to say about it. Even complete differentiation of our dominant function attitude would leave the core of the personality incomplete and unbalanced. My own heroic introverted intuition, he's an INTJ, so he has dominant introvert intuition, needs to be counterbalanced by the extroverted orientation. Without these influence, I would be a caricature of an introverted male. Goes on to say, introverted intuition that is completely untempered by extroverted sensation would be almost pathologically ungrounded. Its visioning proclivity drifting off into irrelevant fantasy. A true blossoming of my NI dominant is only possible if accompanied by some differentiation and integration of my extroverted sensing anima, or the inferior function. No other function attitude could supplement introvert intuition as perfectly as extroverted sensation. And I feel like I'm kind of diving into the deep end by talking about the spine of the personality, but I think it's really important when we're dealing with explaining the dominant function. So the arms of the personality, these would be the middle two functions in your cognitive function stack. So your auxiliary function and your tertiary function. These are the functions that are associated with our relationships to the outer world, particularly people. And John Beebe, who created the 8-function model, said the arms axis are about ways of caring for and being cared for by others. Ways of caring for and being cared for by others, and relating and interacting. Okay, so now that we've gone over the stack and kind of how that shows up, what it looks like, we just know that we're going to get more in depth into that in future streams. Now we're going to bring our attention back specifically to the dominant function. So you can call that the dominant function. You can call it the hero. Some people, if you are a fan of personality hacker system, they call it the driver. This is the function that directs or dominates the personality. It has the most conscious energy at its command and determines the degree of consciousness of the other 3 primary functions. This function is typically the first to develop early in childhood. We play with and employ and trust this function first, believing it will help us solve our problems and succeed. It has a more mature quality to it than the other functions, and we tend to engage in it more automatically. So actually, Denzel, I'm definitely interested in your thoughts here, because I know you are a personality profiler and have been doing this for a long time. And one of the questions I think at one point you mentioned to me that you ask people when you're trying to type them is, what were you like as a kid? And I think that's actually really helpful, because that's when the dominant function is going to be the most obvious, is in childhood. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you and just ask your thoughts on the dominant function and how you might have seen that when you're typing people in their childhood experiences.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that when it comes to the dominant function, it is probably the most subconscious function that we're using. And the reason why I believe that is because I really do see it as kind of like a fish in water. So, like, the fish doesn't even know that they're in water. Like, for me, as an example, as an ENFJ, it's so obvious to me, like, how we should talk to each other a lot of times, like the type of tone that we should use, how to deepen a relationship with another person, how not to probably like offend somebody else, with what you say or like how you say it, stuff like that. I'm always keyed into the interpersonal dynamics of people, and what's going on with that. And that's been the case ever since I was younger. And I think that, and that's, because of extroverted feeling being my dominant function. So it's very, very intrigued with, reading people's interactions and seeing how they interact with each other, and how, like, and what's the best ways to build those interactions on a deeper level. And then from that, as you grow older, then you start to develop like bigger and more complex ways of how to develop that. Because I think that something that I have come to believe is that even if something is your dominant function, that just might mean that it's a talent, but it's not necessarily a skill. So that means that you if you're a TE dom, you could have a talent with, metrics and being able to get things done and like projects and stuff like that. But when you build skill around it, when you actually like pay attention to it, to actually like, enhance and develop all of the other attributes that dominant function has, then that's when you really start to like come in strong with it. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people, when I coach them, like that's what I'm trying to help them do. And that's what I try to do with myself as well. Like, okay, I noticed that my extroverted feeling, like, it's been like this, but how can I take it to the next level? And then you study people who used extroverted feeling to a very extravagant scale, such as, last week, like we said, like Martin Luther King Jr., in my opinion. And then you start trying to like model after that, like what did they study, like how did they use that in those ways. So yeah, that's I think that's why BB calling it the hero was so on par, because it really is the function that just comes in, like it just wants to save the day. It's like, hey, like this is the water that I swim in. I'm so good here, like, and it's almost so good to the point where when I'm profiling people, they don't even know how good they are at it, because again, it's like the water that they're in. So it's like you might even ask like a TE dominant, like, yeah, so like, are you like good at like getting things done? Like, are you good at handling projects? Are you like good at making like hard decisions, stuff like that? And they might be like, oh yeah, I mean, yeah, and they kind of like brush it off a little bit. It's not even usually something they're gonna be like bragging about how proud they are about it. Sometimes, because they also can often see how much better they can be at it. Whereas like people who don't even really have it on their radar, sometimes they're like, man, like they don't see even like how much better they could be good at, like how much better they can be at it. So the dominant function is a very interesting function for that reason, because when you are in water all the time, then you almost forget that you're in water, because it just becomes part of your reality. It's just, it like right now, I literally just operate by watching. Like I intuitively just track status, or I track, who's getting along with who's not getting along with who, why are they getting along, why are they not getting along, how can we better this relationship, stuff like that. And it's just so instinctual at this point that I don't think about it. It's just habit. And I feel like that's something that a lot of people also tend to get into when it comes to their dominant function. So it's the hero that you really bring in to almost solve like every problem, which can often work, but there's a reason why we have the other functions, which we'll talk about in a different interview or video.
Thank you, Denzel. That was really practical, really helpful information. I appreciate you sharing that. What brings us actually to a question Siren of the Void asked. He said, what if our dominant function was repressed due to troubled childhood? Be interested in knowing how that would have affected us. And that's actually a really good question, because I've run into that with people and I've seen it in my own experiences. I knew actually an introverted sensing dominant type who grew up with two intuitive parents, and this person was just really not valued. Their perspectives were not valued. And I knew this person in my childhood. I don't want to name names, but yeah, I knew this person. And what can happen sometimes in a situation where your dominant function isn't valued is you don't actually feel like you can give it the air to breathe to really develop it very well. A lot of different things can happen when you're in maybe a traumatic childhood. Lots of things that I think maybe we should do a whole talk sometime on maybe trauma and type. That would be a really heavy conversation, but I think it might be a good one. But in this particular example, what I saw was that it was an ISTJ. What I saw was that he ended up being in the grip of extroverted intuition a lot. And I think it was being triggered by his being around intuitives all the time. So it was like, okay, if I want to be heard, then I have to be in this extroverted intuitive space. But it wasn't healthy. And then the other extroverted intuitives in the family were just annoyed at him because they're like, why you suck at this? But they don't know that that's what they're saying. They're just irritated because his version of trying to fit in, his brand of extroverted intuition, because it was inferior, was more childish. And he wasn't able to really, he had a lot of amazing gifts of introverted sensing. And as he grew up and became an adult and became, joined a workplace where that was valued, all of a sudden it just exploded with potential, and he was really competent and really valued and where he worked and things like that. But not having your dominant function valued can be extremely difficult. It can really thwart your ability to really live it up, like experience its potential. And I think depending on how it wasn't valued, it can affect you in different ways. And like I said, I think that would be a really great conversation to do an entire stream around, because it could go in a lot of different directions. So thank you for asking that question. And let's see if there's just any other questions really quick. Let's see. And Flow State, welcome. As an ESTP, he says, anecdotally, my dad is an ENTJ, which is SE, extroverted sensing, seeking in socionics. Makes sense. I'd be rewarded for displaying extroverted sensing. So socionics is a similar but different typology system. And yeah, so ENTJs appreciate extroverted sensing because it's their tertiary function. And so they often can get along pretty well with extroverted sensing dominant types. It's really helpful to live in a family that has egosyntonic functions with yourself. Egosyntonic meaning your parents value the same cognitive functions. They have the same functions in their primary stack as you do. So if you were an INFJ, one of your parents has introverted intuition or extroverted feeling, and so they can honor your functions maybe more easily than in a family where they don't. All right, let's go ahead and keep moving on. So energy in the dominant function. Using the dominant function expends little energy. Just as using your preferred hand feels automatic and using your non-preferred hand is more of a struggle, using your dominant function tends to be more automatic. So when you write your names, I'm right-handed, and if I write my name with my right hand, it's easy. I don't really have to think about it. But if I were to do the same exact thing with my left hand, it would be really horrible looking. It would not look good at all. And being in the energy of your dominant function can feel like using your preferred hand. It's just the more automatic way you come to express yourself, or the more automatic way you come to perceive the world. But again, if you have a background or a lifestyle currently where that's not valued, then that can make life really hard. For example, if you are an extroverted thinking type, but you are in a family of extroverted feeling types, then like everyone might think you're a jerk all the time, because they're like, why are you being so pushy, or why are you thinking about metrics instead of how people feel? If they're not, especially if they don't know about type. I'm pretty sure if Denzel was in a family with an extroverted thinking type, that extroverted thinking type would feel valued, as evidenced by all his NTJ friends. But most families out there don't know about type. A lot of them don't, and they don't appreciate the different ways people show they care. So if you're an extroverted thinking type and you're a family of extroverted feeling types, just living automatically and extroverted thinking might feel like it's walking in a minefield, and you're constantly causing these explosions and conflicts for the people that you care about. So in this type of a situation, your dominant function might feel like you might feel like you have to repress your dominant function all the time, because you never know who you're going to offend. So yes, absolutely, environment plays a huge role. And I'm going to ask Denzel, what do you think about that, about environment and whether one's dominant function is accepted or rejected?
Yeah, I think that environment definitely plays a huge role as well, because I know, like for me, for example, my father is an ENFJ and my mother's an ISFJ. And so FE, it was like extra enhanced for me because I had my father, even though my father was taken from me like as a teenager. So I only had him for like up to like I was about 14, 15. But I I was able to witness how, and I didn't know type back then, but or anything, but I was able to witness how he used his FE, so that to the point like when I had learned about FE, then I was able to recognize like the ways that my father did the same thing in like very, grand ways. And if you have, a family who, like, I know an ENTP who, this was like a few years ago, but he has an ESFP father. And whenever the ENTP would like maybe ask certain questions or make certain quips that were like very like NE based, then the ESFP dad would be like, "You're so weird," and I kind of like shuddered a little bit because I knew that like the ESFP father didn't mean to be like pushing down the guy's NE, but this is like discouraging him from asking certain questions and being in that and exercising his strongest function to be able to learn. And this happens all the time, with people who are going to school and stuff like that, and they're learning in ways that are maybe not as conventional. Then all of a sudden now it's like being like pressed down. And so maybe even like SE DOMs who they need to like mess with stuff and break things and like touch things and everything. Of course, all children need to pretty much do that, but like SE DOMs, like especially like take a little bit more risk so that they can like learn from those visceral things and everything like that. If they have like a very very safe parent who's like keeping them from doing all of that, then their SE could really be like taken down. Even for me, like even though like NI is not my dominant function, I had I was around at a certain point like people who whenever I would try to like speak in like more metaphor, like not trying, like that's just naturally how I speak, but when I would start speaking like more metaphorical abstract language, and reading into like certain movies and stuff like that, then they would kind of like give me weird looks and pretty much like make fun of me for trying to interpret a dream and stuff like that. So then all of a sudden you just stop, using and exercising that function of yours. But if you are, of course, in an environment that is like, wow, that's so cool, and it's like rewarding you for being good at your dominant function, not only are you going to continue to be good at it, you're going to become probably the best at it. So I think that, yeah, being around the right types of people who encourage you and who allow you to like really explore that definitely plays a big part.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, I think this is where I think knowing about type can be one of the most powerful things is when it comes to family and romantic relationships, like with your spouse, your kids, your parents. Is I see so much. I don't know if I want to use the word trauma, but I'll just use that word trauma happening in families because there's an interaction of functions where either the parent or the kid or the spouse is seeing another family member's functions and interpreting them in a very negative way and making a lot of projections about the intent with which that function is being used. And we'll get into a lot of those dynamics as we get into the shadow functions, but it can happen. It's really sad when that happens with the dominant function, where a kid is blossoming into, say, extroverted intuition. Maybe they're a little ENFP kid, and so they have dominant extroverted intuition, and they're really blossoming into it. They're pointing out alternatives. They're coming up with these amazing creative possibilities, and maybe they have a parent who extroverted intuition is in their shadow, and the parent is just thinking, why is this kid so oppositional? Why is this kid so defiant? And they're projecting all this negative intent onto the kid. And it has nothing to do with the kid's actual intent. It has everything to do with how that parent is interpreting that child. And this kind of thing just happens all the time. And a lot of times, like in the situation that Denzel talked about with the, I believe, ESFP and ENTP, a lot of times the parent isn't trying to be mean or hurtful. Almost nobody has a child and thinks, I want to emotionally damage this kid. I'm so excited to do that. They're like, want to do what's best. But it can be very hard to do, especially if you don't know how your child is wired and the intent with which they're coming to situations. And if you know how you are wired, so you can understand when you're projecting bad intent onto another person in your family. So I think I really, what I used to do before I was doing as much writing is I used to really like talking to families about type, because you could see all these really interesting interplays between all these different people. And the bigger the family, the more complex it gets. And it's just really fun. All right. So back to the dominant function. If you notice that you or someone else has shifted into a leading the charge mode, as if carrying out a dramatic banner ahead of the troops with complete confidence in the rightness of the action or position, and serious, therefore, that others will be compelled to follow. You've probably seen the energy signature of the hero or heroine. So it's not called the dominant function for nothing. It's the one that wants to lead, direct, dominate. It feels it, if you have a good relationship with your dominant function, it's the one that you really feel is the right tool for all the jobs. And when a situation comes around that it really is the right tool for the job, you do tend to have this very heroic energy, like, I'm going to jump in here and save the day. And for example, for myself as an INTJ, when I see someone whose life is maybe in a particular type of chaos, like maybe financially or something like that, I can easily be like, oh, I know what you can do. Let's look at your life goals and your budget, and let's come up with a strategy for investments and things like that. And then it gets me really excited, and I'm like, I have the answers for everything for you. And it's and that's how it is with everyone's dominant function if they have a good relationship with it. If you are an ENFJ or an ESFJ, I don't want to speak for Denzel, but you probably feel like if people need connectivity, or there's tension in the atmosphere and someone needs to come along and just get people interacting in a more healthy, harmonious way, if you're an extroverted feeling type, then you probably feel like, oh yes, I'm going to be the hero and come in and fix the mood. So there is this confidence that comes with the dominant function that you just it's hard to see that same level of confidence with the other functions in the stack.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely a place that's like a god complex for many people. Like I always just straight up say like ever since I became aware of it, I just kind of like laugh at it, and it just is what it is. Like I have a god complex. I just always like tell people like I have a god complex, not in oh yes, I can help you with your math, because no, I know where I am not good at. But I definitely know that I'm very good at helping mend relationships, helping deepen relationships, helping diffuse conflict, stuff like that, like creating a place that's going to be good for intimacy, things of that nature. I feel like I know what's best for a person, often, sometimes in my head, even more than they might think that they know what's best for themselves. But, of course, even with that thought in my head, I have to do well to, uh, even though I can't help that I might think that, it's best to not act on it all the time. Um, and yeah, just like moving with it in that way. But yeah, you have like the ni doms who might also be very I guess what's the word I'm looking for with that, uh you might have ni doms who think that they know exactly what's going to happen inevitably, and so with that reason it's just like no, like that's just it, like this is what's going to happen, and you have to like listen to what I'm saying, and like or else you're all doomed kind of thing. You might have the se doms who are very like they have a god complex of like, oh, I know how to get us through whatever situation that we might tackle, like just follow me, like I can maneuver through this, kind of thing. There's a lot of different ways that people can have like a god complex in their dominant function, because yeah, that is the hero. Like I'm the hero. Like I like think of a hero archetype. Like they need to be the one that kind of like saves the day. They need to be like in the shining light and the glory of it all. They need to look good. They need the other people to kind of like admire them and like know that yes, I am here. And so when you think of your dominant function, that's usually the kind of energy that it's showing up with.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, and one of the things that you're talking about, I think, is like this inflated dominant function too. Is that because it's so automatic? We talked about what happens if your dominant function is rejected growing up, but then if your dominant function is praised a lot, sometimes what can happen is you end up with an inflated dominant function where it's you definitely think it's the answer to everything, and you're more likely to get this, like, I mean, everyone can have a messiah complex, I think, even a healthy person, about their dominant function. But if you're in a family where it's like, oh wow, you have such a, say you're an INJ and you have INJ parents. They're like, wow, you have an amazing insights. I just love the way you think. You're incredible. And then the other kid is like an SE dominant type, an ESTP, and they're like, why can't you just think about the future? Why are you so impulsive? Why are you so reckless? What's wrong with you? And the ESP is being talked down to, and the INJ is being praised. Then the INJ can just feel like they are a more evolved human and they are actually legitimately better than their sibling. And then you end up with an inflated dominant function. And the ESTP child might be looking at the NJs in the family and being like, you guys think you're so smart, but you literally cannot see your feet beneath your body. Like, you don't actually know what's going on around you. You're very impractical. You're totally ungrounded. Your head's in the air. Like, because an inflated dominant function isn't counterbalanced by the inferior function very well. And in order to have a healthy dominant function, you also have to respect your inferior function. So if you are an INJ type, you need to respect extroverted sensing as well. Otherwise, you're going to have this really ungrounded outlook on life, and your visions, no matter how profound they may be, are going to be kind of pointless and impractical because you're going to be too unrealistic to make anything actually work. And that goes for all the functions. All right, so here we've talked about this already, but yeah, we think it's the right tool for the job. Because using our dominant function is so automatic, we naturally tend to think it should be used to fix everything and deal with all the challenges life gives us. This is especially true if it's inflated. So imagine this hammer is, I don't know, let's call it introverted sensing. And a task comes along that requires a lot of attention to detail and, sequentially organizing, like, I don't know, taxes. I'm just going to say taxes, even though that fits more with ISTJ than ISFJ. Well, it really hammered down that nail really well. But then it's going along and it's like, oh, we need to, the ISTJ is thinking, I need to, I don't know, predict some future event. Well, then when it hammers the nail, it's like with introverted sensing, it's just bending the nail because introverted sensing is trying to look at the past to predict the future in this way that isn't really working as well as something like introverted intuition would. All right, so now we get into the different types of dominant functions. And I know we've already been through the cognitive functions in depth in our previous live streams, but in case this is your first stream or you want to just get a very quick look at what the cognitive functions look like in the dominant position, we're just going to jump into a little of that. But before I do, I want to again ask Denzel if you have any thoughts before we move on to the next section.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think that well, Jessica had asked like the examples of the God complex are like helpful and to go down the line. I think that I'll just try to like rapidly do that, maybe like just really quickly. Like FI DOMs, for example, could have a God complex of like, I know how you feel. Like, even though that seems like a FE DOM kind of thing, like FI DOMs, I've seen that a lot with them. Like sometimes like my ISFP wife will tell me, like, I know how you feel, especially because I'm an FE DOM and I'm a 9. Then FE and 9s, they usually don't know how they like they have to like work to know how they feel and everything. So since she's like, no, I know how you feel, and how would you know that you know how you feel if you don't even know how you feel, kind of thing. So like they will often like project what they feel that you feel onto you, and they might also have like the moral high ground of certain things. Like I have examined like what real moral values and stuff like that might be, and so then it's like if you don't agree with their values, then they could feel like rubbed differently about that. For NE dominance, I think that a God complex for them could be that they feel like they have the most creative ideas. And a lot of times that, when there's these God complex ideas are there for a reason. And so I feel like, yeah, they might think that, oh yeah, like I have the monopoly on like creativity. I have the monopoly on being able to know like what we should do if it comes to like innovation and stuff like that. Perhaps yeah, like I said, the TE DOMs, they usually feel like they know what's just the best action to take. like oh no, like trust me, this is the right action to take, nobody question it, I know what I'm doing. The TI DOMs, they can have a God complex of their logic being like flawless, like I have the right answer. That's just that. Like, you have not done the math the way that I've done it. I've done it very crucially, just kind of like the FI Dom. That's like, I know what's moral and what's not moral because I've really gone through all of that. Whatever the TI Dom can be like, yeah, no, I know what's accurate and what's inaccurate. You're not as good with the math as I am. And SI, I think that we just kind of like talked about that, but it's like it could be a God complex of like the procedure of how something should be, like, and like knowing like, no, we should keep things like this way. Like, I know the best way to do things, which is a different way from the TE, because it's not about like the course of action to take, but it's just more of like the procedure in which something might be. And I think that's probably everything. Yeah.
Those are some great on the spot examples. Thank you, Denzel. It's hard to think of answers sometimes like right on the spot like that. All right, so let's see, and maybe we can even explore that a little more as we talk about these functions in the slides now. So dominant introverted intuition. It imagines, foresees, conceptualizes, understands, synthesizes, symbolizes ideas, and predicts. I'm sure you all can read, so you don't really actually need me to read that, but anyway, there it is for you. But so yeah, introverted intuitive dominant types spend a lot of time in their imagination, a lot of time focusing on concepts, symbols, ideas, predictions. As an example, whenever I'm thinking of an explanation for something, I never actually think in words. I'm always thinking in metaphors or symbols. Always. Like in my imagination, it's always a metaphor or a symbol. I'm not actually thinking in words. And so when I try to explain something, a lot of times I will have to stop until I have the right metaphor or symbol in my brain with which to explain what I'm talking about. And unfortunately, sometimes even if you have the perfect metaphor, if you're talking to someone who doesn't really like dealing with metaphors, it just falls completely flat. And you're like, I just dreamed up this amazing metaphor to explain how I'm feeling in life. And now they have no idea what I'm talking about. But dominant introverted intuition is always focusing on ripple effects, underlying patterns, what's really going on here. It's always asking what's really going on here, what's really the deeper meaning of something. And yeah, when it's inflated, it's very ungrounded. It's so focused on looking for a deeper meaning that it can miss what's right in front of its face. And it can be very hard to understand. Introverted intuitives who are not healthy, who have a really inflated dominant function, can be difficult to understand because they're drawing out so many very personal symbols of what they're going through or what they're trying to explain that it's not tethered at all to reality, and then it makes it very difficult to understand what they're trying to communicate.
And then also a lot of times it's hard for them to get into action. That's where a lot of the SC inferior comes in. Like, okay, I know you have this grand plan, but what have you done? Why haven't you started it? Like, you can talk about how great your plan is like all your life, but then if you haven't put your plan into action, then what? Well, what good was the plan? So
Absolutely. Yeah. INJs, both INTJs and INFJs are both chart the course types, which is Linda Barron's. She's a psychologist who studied the interaction styles of different types. So both the dominant introverted intuitive types, they really like foreseeing, conceptualizing, and mapping out a plan or a vision. But sometimes, yeah, they can get so focused on continuously conceptualizing it or planning it that they never actually jump into action for it. And can be a big problem of inflated introverted intuition. All right, so dominant extroverted intuition. This function infers, hypothesizes, wonders, brainstorms, experiments, transforms. This is a function that is focused on creating more and more and more possibilities, options, ideas, where the introverted intuitive is more likely to hone in on one specific vision. An extroverted intuitive wants to live in many different possibilities. And if you were part of my stream with Crystal Duan about extroverted intuition a couple weeks ago, she talked about that, about how as an ENFP, She likes to live in all the possibilities. She wants to play with all of them. And so there's not so much a narrowing down of one specific vision as much as creating lots and lots and lots of ideas. Extrovert intuition is good at finding random connections between things. How is a cat like a bowl of cereal? They would probably be able to come up with some reason why they're connected, whereas me as an INTJ, I would have to think really long and hard about that in order to explain how one is like the other. So sometimes this shows up in their humor, where they can have this kind of really random and hilarious humor where they're drawing all these connections between things. Any thoughts on dominant extroverted intuition, Denzel?
Yeah, I think that dominant extrovert intuition is really focused on being able to innovate things, like having like new ideas. Like a lot of times, so I just talked about the God complex of them being creative, but a lot of times the reason why they're creative is because they forgot what the previous procedure was. So because they're not keeping track of like, oh, what was the right way to do this, or like, dang, how did I do this last time? Because that would be more SI, which is their inferior function. Then they're like, let me just find a different way to do this. And so then people are like, wow, you found like 500 different ways to do that same thing. You're so creative, which is true. But a lot of times they're not even really trying to be creative. they're just more they're just more so like just they forgot how to do it the procedural way, and so they found like a new way to do it because that's just how their mind works.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah, and when I was responding to a comment, so I kind of zoned out a little bit while you were talking. I'm sorry. But if you didn't give this example already, one of the signs that someone's using inflated extroverted intuition is they're so busy in creating new possibilities that they just are very impractical. Anytime intuition, whether it's extroverted or introverted, is dominant and it's inflated, it's impractical, because it's just like, I'm going to create 12 ways that I could make macaroni and cheese. I know I have to be somewhere in 10 minutes and I should have just made the kind out of the box. But like, I didn't want to do it that way because that's boring. So it's just like, sometimes it can just reinvent the wheel. So it's just like not working with something that is tried and true and proven and practical right now. Instead, it's just creating newness for the sake of creating newness. And then it can just end up creating like a lot of issues where there's just a waste of time or things like that. All right, dominant introverted sensing. This function reviews, recalls, it links the present to the past, compares and contrasts, notices differences and similarities, and preserves. So introverted sensing, when it's in the dominant position, as an introverted sensor goes through life. So these would be the ISFJs and the ISTJs, by the way. I don't know if I did that with the last functions. If you're new to type and you're like, who uses this? So extrovert intuition, dominant types are ENFPs and ENTPs. Introverted intuition dominant types are INFJs and INTJs. And introverted sensing dominant types are ISFJs and ISTJs. And these types as they go through life, it's as if there's a filter over the present experience that's comparing what's happening now with a similar experience from the past. And so they can very quickly see when something changes. So if they go into a room, they might notice right away if you moved your furniture, whereas someone who has inferior introverted sensing might not be aware at all because they're just not focusing on the tangible as much. As with all sensing functions, introverted sensing is focused more on the tangible world than on the abstract world. So what can be seen, felt, touched, tasted, examined, and experienced via the senses. Introverted sensing wants to create stability, to preserve positive and meaningful traditions. It wants to create a sense of continuity in life. So these are the types that, they tend to have very specific routines, like maybe every Friday night they drink chamomile tea in the bathtub while reading Harry Potter, or, something like that, where they just have these special rituals and traditions that give them a sense of continuity and peace and tranquility in life. And they're really good at paying attention to these details that a lot of other people miss, because as introverts, ISJs really like zoning in on the details. It gives them a sense of satisfaction to be able to do that. So I know like 3 ISTJ accountants, and I hate to always use them as accountants because I know there's plenty of ISTJs who do other things. But I know 3 ISTJ accountants, and they love zoning in on all these accounting details. And they actually, like, one of them, it's like their hobby is just doing their taxes every year and like finding all the deductions they can get. Whereas I know ISFJs who are really good at sewing, or they're really good at sculpting. It's just like getting into all the details of how they can do it is really exciting for them. Any thoughts, Denzel, on dominant introverted sensing?
Yeah, I think that you pretty much hit the nail on the head. They're just I just always really see them as like they're the true perfectionists. Like, I have been doing this for the past 15 years. And so I know the right ways to do this and the wrong ways to do this. And I paid attention to all of the details on how to do it. And so, yeah, a lot of times they won't want to stray from what has happened. It reminds me of uh, Colette from Ratatouille, who I think that she was probably like, I think she was an STJ. And there was one like the chef that they were learning from, like there was a point where she said something like, no, 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 it was his job to think of what the new recipe might be, like the new meal might be. But for us, you follow the recipe. So whenever Remy, who I actually thought was extrovert intuition dominant, was trying to be a little bit more creative with like how to make certain things, like, oh, let's try this, let's try that, then Colette would get like a little bit upset, although she thought that it was linguine because Remy was in the hat. And if you haven't seen this movie, you're probably very weirded out, like, what is happening? But yeah, like, it's really much the follow the recipe, follow the procedure kind of thing, because they're like, this is what's always going to work, point blank period. And if we stray away from it, then now we don't know if it's going to work anymore. Now we have to pay attention to new details. Now we have to like track a new kind of thing. So yeah.
Thank you, Denzel. That's a great example. We have a question here from Siren of the Void. He asks, would introverted intuition be into the past too, but in a more abstract manner, sort of like a global vision? And I do believe that introverted intuition can pick up patterns from the past and that, that tie into their current moment and then project them on into the future. They don't typically tend to reflect on the past as much in as great detail of the concrete nature of the past. Like, as an example, an ISFJ might walk through the woods and see leaves falling and remember very specifically how they walked through the same woods with their father, with their grandfather, and this were the types of trees. They were this specific type of tree, and the leaves were falling in this particular way. And it's like they remember the texture of the corduroy jacket that their father was wearing. And there's a lot of concrete details that they're pulling from that. Yes, the details have meaning to them, very much so, but they know, it's like they know those details and they were honing in on those details. Whereas introverted intuition, it might also, everyone uses all the functions. So you're going to have times where even an introvert intuitive could look back and remember the details. But when they look back, it's more going to be, what kind of conceptual meaning did I get out of this experience of walking in the woods? I remember walking in the woods and I had this amazing metaphor in my mind of how these trees are a symbol of my growth in, I don't I'm like going blank on an example, but like my business growth or something. And that's too NTJ. You're an ENFJ.
I had another INTJ who had the same thing, Lauren. I just asked her one day, like, hey, so how was your day? And like, whatever. And she was like, oh yeah, she went for a hike in the woods or whatever. And then I asked like, oh, did you see anything interesting there? And she's like, oh, well, I did actually take a picture of this tree and I wrote something down. And it was a tree that had fallen over a creek. And she pretty much wrote this beautiful thing about how, it's not always bad to be uprooted, because from being uprooted, it creates a bridge to get across to the other side. I was like, oh my God, you're mine. And to her, she didn't even think of it as deep. She just kind of like wrote it down in her phone. She didn't even post it on Instagram or anything like that. And I'm like, that's really like insightful. But so you can imagine, like, again, it's like that this is the water that the NI user like just breathes. You know what I mean? But if it was like an SI user, then yeah, they're probably like looking at the past and they're like, yeah, I just remember the details once again of like how like how green it was around there, and like I think it's almost like when you're reading books and they talk about everything having to do with it. Like, I remember the locks in her hair and the eyes that were like crystal blue, and like all of those things that paint the picture for you. I think that a lot of times like that's like very like SI, whereas like NI is like, oh, I forgot what shirt they were wearing. I just remember the story that they had told and the symbolism behind it and all of that.
Yeah, that's a great compare and contrast right there. I mean, it did bring to mind, which I don't know why I didn't think of this, but I remember like when I was growing up, whenever I would go into the forest or anything like that, and I always prefer to do it alone because, an INJ, I would always think of the trees as these like big shepherds watching over like civilizations of people going under them. And I remember like thinking of them as these like tall, protective shepherds that were just like quietly like protecting people in some way. And so I remember being a kid and like always being like, I would actually talk to them. That sounds really weird, but I'd be like, thank you so much. I
I
remember sitting
love
under trees
that
and like
so much.
having conversations that, yeah, I didn't think
Oh,
I was gonna actually
Susan, that's
admit
so
that.
cute.
Yeah,
I love that.
that was something that popped out of my mouth, and then I'm like, why am I actually admitting that? But anyway, but yeah, so like, yeah, a lot of things can hold symbolic meaning, and that's what the NI type is more likely to remember than the specific details. Like, I couldn't tell you what type of tree I was sitting under. I don't know if it was like an oak tree or a sycamore tree or anything like that. I just know it was a tree, but I know what it meant to me in a symbolic way rather than what it meant to me in as far as the details are concerned. Alrighty, so extroverted sensing. Oh, sorry, I'll put this down here. Extroverted sensing in the dominant position observes, spots opportunities, experiences, adapts, varies, stays present, and takes action. So, when you are an ESTP or ESFP, these are the two types of dominant extroverted sensing, you are highly aware of the details of your environment in real time, like what's happening right now. And you're very conscious of opportunities right now, whether you're in the stock market and you can immediately spot, ooh, I need to buy or sell that stock, or whether you're taking a walk in the city and you see some people playing basketball and you want to jump right in. It can show up in lots of different ways. A lot of times people use sports references, but I've know a lot of ESTPs and ESFPs who love sports, but I also know some that don't, and it shows up more in opportunities, creative opportunities, or so many different ways. But extroverted sensing dominant types are all about living life to the fullest, seizing the day, actually experiencing what's available to them in the moment. And they like to adapt to unexpected situations. They like newness, just like a lot of people associate a love of novelty and newness with the ENP types, but ESP types also love novel experiences, new situations where they have to kind of be on their toes because they never know quite what new sensory experience could present itself. They like to take action, and a lot of people think of extroverts as people who just want to chat all the time. There's often this like annoying extrovert stereotype that they basically just talk nonstop. And while you can indeed have chatty extroverted sensing types, a lot of times they'd rather be actually doing something than just sitting around talking about something. Like you might get them talking while they're playing a game of cornhole or while they're taking a walk or driving or whatever, but just sitting and talking tends to make them a little bit bored a lot of times. They need to be doing something at the same time. There's always a driving desire for some type of action. Any thoughts from you, Denzel?
Yeah, I feel like extroverted sensing as a dominant function is, yeah, it's really all about the visceral. Like what, and it's like we talked about, this function already. But when it's a dominant, it's way more focused on what's happening right now and what is actually there. Like what are we actually looking at? Let's not read deep into it. Like, let's not try to figure out like what the meaning behind it or any. What is the facts? What is happening right now? And how to respond to what's happening right now. Doing something right away, as soon as it pops up. Not letting things like stack up a lot of times. Not trying to sit there and run a simulation, because no, we gotta move. So, and it's all about, again, like the visceral, about the, like, getting tapped in with those five senses in a way. So yeah, it's very present, like you say, very, like, they're very observant. They see a lot, they catch everything that's going on, and they usually are also the quickest responders to these things.
Yeah, thank you, Denzel. And I see some comments. Mr. J, I believe he said last week you were an ESFP type. Says extroverted sensors notice everything. Yes, extremely adaptable. Yeah. I'm married to an extroverted sensing dominant type, an ESTP. I know you probably, I feel like I mention him every stream, but yeah, they're really up for changing everything and just like on a whim, like let's go do some crazy thing. Let's move. We've been living in the same place for a whole year. That's forever. We need to get somewhere else. Things like that. All right. So then let's move on to. Oh, and I guess we didn't talk about when it's inflated. So inflated extroverted sensing would be so focused on the experiences of the moment that it's not thinking of the long-term consequences of things. So it kind of leaps before it looks. It might be a little hedonistic or reckless, very focused on pleasure and fun, but maybe at the cost of health or other practical details. All right, so introverted feeling in the dominant position looks inward, weighs beliefs, considers values, seeks internal harmony, and checks for congruency. So introverted feeling is always looking inside and thinking, how do I feel about this? Let me check in and see what my emotional temperature is right now. Am I living in alignment with what I actually feel on a gut level is right? Or is there something inside me that's kind of like off with my values? And it's always considering these things with this fine-tuned needle where it's like, everyone else is going to go hang out at someone's house. And the introverted feeling type is thinking, how do I feel about that? Do I want to go? But also, will my values be respected in this house? Or is my gut telling me anything that I should maybe pay attention to about, how my values will be, how it's going to impact me emotionally or my ethics or my morals or things like that. Denzel, any thoughts on introverted feeling in the dominant position?
Yeah, I think that introverted feeling, when it's in the dominant position, it's not in an offensive way, which is so ironic, but it's very sensitive, because everything that it takes in, it's immediately asking it, how do I feel about this? How does this make me feel? And so it's relating to everything that it takes in, because by doing that, it learns more about itself. And then from learning more about itself, then it becomes like the most, self-aware. Well, sometimes that doesn't mean that you don't have FI users who are not self-aware, but like they become very tapped into like their values and their morals, and what they want in life. And then sometimes, because they're FI dominant, they can focus so much on what they really want, who they really are, what their identity is, all of that. But then they don't want to budge from it. So the things that might actually get them there, like working, which comes from that TE, which is their inferior function by default, then they might not want to work as hard. They might not want to do a job that goes against sort of the things that they are. Like, oh, honey, why did you quit that job? They don't support my values. It's like, all of the values that you have. Like, when are you ever gonna find a job then that does support all those values? And I guess that could be like an inflated version. But yeah, like when you have like FI as a dominant function, those are like the things that it's really like looking at. Like, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about that? And how can I make sure I'm not betraying my own integrity?
Yeah, and introverted feeling is also really good at understanding its own motivations, the good and bad ones. So I think that introverted feeling types are also really good at kind of knowing themselves, and not just the good parts, but like when am I having a bad motivation? When it's healthy, it's just very in touch with all the nuances and shades of gray inside the self and the motivations that are underlying everything. And because they're constantly assessing their own motivations, they also notice other people's motivations, I believe, very well. Or they can, you were talking about inflated introverted feeling a little while ago and how it can be like, I know how you feel. Well, sometimes like healthy introverted feeling will grasp someone's motivation and sense when someone's being manipulative very, very quickly. And then when it's inflated, it's maybe suspicious and paranoid about people and like, I know what their motivations were and it's all bad. But healthy introverted feeling is really good at noticing those motivations, and really it's not good at being fooled or tricked or manipulated by anyone, because it's just really tuned into that. Introverted feeling is also less, and I know this isn't a whole segment on introverted feeling, but it's less expressive on the outside as extroverted feeling tends to be. And it's less, time-wise, it's not as much of a real-time function as maybe extroverted feeling would be either. Introverted feeling types often post-process their emotions, like after the experience. They'll try to process their emotions in real time, but when they're having to extrovert a lot, they're more tapped into maybe their extroverted sensing or extroverted intuition. They spend a lot of time examining their emotions after the fact, but it's not as expressive in real time, whereas extroverted feeling is more of a real time function and it's more expressive in real time. And then that brings us to extroverted feeling. Extroverted feeling is looking outward, considering others, approving or disapproving, connecting and relating, checking for appropriateness, and it's sparked by the here and now. So we just talked about, introverted versus extroverted. Extroverted functions are more sparked by real-time interactions. But extroverted feeling is looking outside at how everyone outside of them is feeling, what they need, what the emotional wavelengths are in the atmosphere, who's feeling bad, who's feeling good, what do people emotionally need, showing approval, or if showing disapproval if someone's really poisoning the atmosphere in some way. Connecting and relating to people, creating bridges that connect people together, building intimacy, building rapport with people. And tactfulness and politeness are all usually very valued by extroverted feeling types. They know kind of the expectations of the room that they're in, whether it's the cultural or societal expectations, whatever it is that's there. They can usually sense when they walk into a room and they're like, oh, we should be really formal here, for example, and use very good manners, be very serious. And if they walk into a room, like, oh no, this is where should all let loose here. This is the vibe of this room. They kind of just know the vibe of the room. And they don't really even have to try if they're extroverted feeling doms most of the time. And I'm going to pass it again over to Denzel since he is an extroverted feeling dominant type.
Yeah, I think that that's pretty much like, again, hitting the nail on the head, like reading the room, understanding like, okay, what's the vibe here? Like, what's the best way to kind of like fit in and not like offset certain things, or to influence the room to, change at like to the temperature that you might want it to, in case if it's sour and people might not really like, that might not really be the vibe. So it depends on what kind, like both are aspects of extroverted feeling. Like, okay, like there's a time to like blend in and just kind of like match the vibe, and there's a time to influence the vibe. But then also, if it's, I guess, like overly inflated, then you're too into what everybody feels about you. You're too politically correct because you're afraid of losing connections with people. So then with inferior TI, it's not necessarily that like, oh man, like I don't have any logical thoughts or anything, or I don't ever think for myself, but it's more like I'm afraid to share those thoughts because I value my connections with these people so much, even if the connections with the people are not as deep, which is something that extroverted feelers usually have to like work on. And so for that reason, it's like, I'm not going to share them because it might get me canceled. It might get me ostracized. It might get people to like not talk to me as much or whatever. But when you're able to actually integrate it, then you learn how to like find your tribe, how to like, tell the truth, but in love, and really like show up with your true self without denying that aspect of yourself.
Thank you, Denzel. Yeah. And Katja commented, and completely forget about themselves. FE, extroverted feeling is so selfless, though. Yeah, another sign it's inflated is, yeah, losing yourself in the emotions and feelings and needs of everyone else. Another way that can show up that I don't think we touched on yet is the mean way. Every function can have a mean side. I mean, maybe that'll be a topic for another stream. But the mean side of extroverted feeling is that it can be kind of create social environments where certain people are maybe shamed or gossiped about because maybe they don't fit the vibe that the extroverted feeling dominant type wants to have in their atmosphere, or they're going against the group values in some way. And then the mean extroverted feeling type, if it's a mean one, it could be like gossiping about that person, creating social rejection for that person, and really letting them know you don't belong here, that kind of thing. And that's where, sometimes I've heard people email me and things like that. Oh, this terrible ESFJ that I knew in high school, who was the mean girl who let everyone, who had to control everything. There's most of the ESFJs I know are amazing. So this is I'm not trying to feed that negative stereotype. It would be like saying all ENTJs are like Voldemort or something. But yeah, unhealthy extroverted feeling can be very cliquey. Like, this is my group and we all have this particular vibe and you don't belong here because you don't really fit in with the social values of my group or something like that. Yeah, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Denzel, either. Okay. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to go through these next ones. Dominant introverted thinking. This is the dominant function of the ISTP and INTP personality types. Dominant introverted thinking clarifies principles, analyzes different sides of an issue, checks for consistency, understands, and troubleshoots. It's always asking, what are the roots? What are the logical principles of this thing? How does this thing work? Whether it's a thing or an idea, if we were to take it apart, what are the core principles of this? Like, a toaster isn't just a toaster. It's a collection of gears and springs and, all these things working together. Or, the theory of evolution. What are all the components of this theory? It's always looking to kind of take something apart to understand its components. And also, by analyzing different sides of an issue, it can show up in sometimes like arguing different sides of an issue to really figure out like what's the truth when we've argued every single facet of this issue. So if you are an INTP or something and you are talking to a Catholic, you might, in examining their Catholic beliefs, you might argue against them in all these different ways. It doesn't necessarily mean you have anything against Catholicism. It's just testing it to see what still stands when I point out these inconsistencies that I see, and then what's left over after I do that. And introverted thinking can even argue against its own perspective sometimes as well. And this kind of depth of wanting to understand things so deeply can mean that ITBs have a really vast and intricate and nuanced understanding of how many different either objects or theories work. And yeah, Denzel, any thoughts on dominant introverted thinking?
Yeah, I always see it as like I know what I think regardless of what everybody else thinks. Like, it doesn't matter if this is going to get me canceled or what. Now, I might not say it, but I know exactly what I think. Oh, shoot, everybody thinks this about this president. In my logical opinion, this is what makes sense to me, and it doesn't really matter. Like, if anybody's ever like watched the Boondocks, like one example could be, if you Google it right now, if you just search Riley Freeman R. Kelly, then there's pretty much like Riley Freeman, he's in ESTP, but he's using his TI like very well in that little clip where he's debating with an ESFJ guy named Tom Dubois, and he's pretty much like going back and forth about like, why did R. Kelly go to jail for what he did, like back in the day and everything. And he's making like this argument, like, if somebody's like, doing this action to you, you could just move and this is that. And he's just mainly just talking about what makes sense to him, and listening to anybody else listening to him could be like, oh my gosh, but that's so wrong. Like, that's not good. Like the FE might, like, it's just wrong. But for him, he's like, this makes sense. And you guys can't deny that this makes sense, even though you think that it's wrong. So that's, I think, a lot of times like what introverted thinking, especially the dominant function, is. And then that's why they can also get in trouble a lot of times for speaking up, because they think things that might not be popular with the general public. And so then they're like, man, every time that I speak up, then I say something that upsets people. So I'm just going to keep my mouth shut. And that's why they tend to sometimes also be like loners, or sometimes even overly do the FE inferior, where you have like very, very polite INTPs, because they're just like, I don't know what I might say at any point that might trigger someone. So let me just be quiet. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of ITPs had it pretty rough when they were kids, unless they had thinking, perceiving parents. I think it's one of the two types that I feel like I consistently seen having the hardest time in childhood, because that tendency to argue, to want to debate different sides of an issue, to try to do that in order to figure out what actually does make sense to me, it's just often seen as very rebellious, antagonistic, and a lot of people project a lot of negative intent onto it that wasn't there. Even arguing against something moral, like as I've not seen this specific episode of the Boondocks, but he's arguing the logic of this very moral issue, and they could argue that just because they're trying to understand it, they may not even agree with what they're arguing about. They're not even saying
Yeah,
like,
that's
"Oh,
a
I
big
think
thing. Yeah.
I think R. Kelly should be let off." Like they're not even saying that. They're just like thinking out the logic of this, and
Yeah.
but people will assume that because they are arguing it, that they actually have a value there. Like they're putting their flag in the ground and saying, I think this is totally okay. And that's a huge misunderstanding of introverted thinking and how it
Yeah, they
works.
just want to know what is right, regardless of what other people might like. They want to know what's accurately right, not regardless of what might be morally right or wrong. That's mainly like what it is. Like, okay, I know that everybody's gonna get mad at me for thinking this or whatever. Fine, but is this right or is it not? Like, that's what I want to know. So that's pretty much what it is. Like, they're very detached from what that might be.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think I have a lot of sympathy for introverted thinking types for that reason. And then we're going to end with extroverted thinking, which can have some of the same problems with misunderstandings. But extroverted thinking looks outward, weighs evidence, organizes, monitors, outlines, segments, and is sparked by the here and now. So the extroverted thinking dominant type is taking in their environment all the time and thinking, what needs to be organized to make us reach our objectives faster? Like, this kitchen is terribly organized because if I wanted to bake a cake, I would have all my mixing bowls all the way over there when I really need them here, and the flour is here. This doesn't make sense. I mean, that's kind of a sensory way to explain extroverted thinking, but it's can always see ways to better make the environment more effective and efficient to reach certain objectives. And so extroverted thinking types are always thinking, they think a lot in terms of metrics and pass fail, like, will this work? Will it not work? What does the evidence show? When you're talking to an extroverted thinking type, their initial stance is going to be somewhat skeptical, especially if you say something like, oh, did you hear that? I don't know. The Earth there's this big asteroid headed towards Earth or whatever. They're immediately going to be skeptical because they constantly want evidence. They want evidence, they want proof, they want empirical logic to back things up. And so they tend to seem a little bit skeptical, but they're very good at outlining, organizing, segmenting, making tasks efficient so that objectives can be reached in a timely way. They are very, very focused on time. I'm not extrovert thinking dominant, but as a TJ who has extroverted thinking, I'm highly focused on time. If you want to offend a TJ type, waste their time. Like, they will hate it. They will feel like you do not respect them as a person. You do not care about them. Just like an extroverted feeling type, an FJ, they will feel like you don't care about them if you don't, connect with them, or you don't affirm their values or their feelings and things like that. A TJ, if you are wasting their time, they will feel like you don't even see them. Like, what am I to you? Just like nothing, because you're sitting here wasting my time, because they often have their eye on the clock. And and all the things they need to do. And if you're in the block of time that is quality time with this person, then go ahead and waste their time. They'll be happy about it because they organize that time specifically for that. But if you're not, then they might get frustrated with you. Okay, maybe that was a little too much on that, but Your thoughts, Denzel. What do you think about dominant extroverted thinking?
Yeah, no, I think that you hit the nail on the head once again. Yeah, extroverted thinking as a dominant function is really just focused a lot on what works and what doesn't work. And again, we did like a whole video live stream on this, so you guys can like go over there and like check that out more in detail. But yeah, when it's like a dominant function, it's like, okay, does this work or does this not work? That might even be a person. And sometimes they might not even bring in the personal element of it, because then it's like, oh, I'm running this business. Does this person work or do they not work? But boss, this person just lost their son to cancer. And so that's why all of a sudden it's like, and if the TE
I
Dom
feel
does
bad
not
because I'm
have
laughing.
FI, integrated, then they might be like, that's sad, but we have to fire him because he's causing the company to go down. That's the logical thing to do. Again, not every TE Dom is going to be like that, but that's a lot of the ways that the TE, like they make the hard decisions. Like, this is how we have to do things because it's the most logical, most effective, most working way to do the thing. And so they look at things in that way, keeping things organized, and they really just have like a set plan a lot of times for how to approach things.
Thank you. All right. So, any questions before we go? Our stream usually ends at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. So we've got about 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions, I see a comment from Katja here. I don't know if it's a question, but she says, I mean, my sister is ESTJ, and not having max points and not being the first pisses her off and puts more time and effort to be the best with efficient behavior. Yeah, they can be very competitive. Yeah, for sure. TJs can be very competitive. I think anyone can be competitive, but it's more common among ETJs.
I agree.
As well as like ESTPs are really competitive too, I think.
Yeah.
But as an example, I'm not a dominant extrovert thinker, but like I worked at a bank call center when I was 17, and they would always put up a chart on the wall of like how many calls people took in the day and what their like performance reviews were. And I got into this huge competition with like two other guys in the bank about who would answer the most calls and get the highest ratings and the most surveys at the end of the call. And it was like, it was game on when I walked into that call center and the other guys were there because we were gonna be like on fire.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
that competitive.
TJs are looking for results, and they like the reward. They like the hit from the results. So that could be, getting certain points. That could be getting what they were working for. That could be money. Whatever it might be. It's like they like to do something and then see that they got something back in return. So that's like mainly what it is for a lot of TJs. And if they're not getting something back in return, well, then that was a waste of time. And so no, they're not going to put energy there. But if it's like, oh, I did all of this and now I got back all of this money, or I got back this accolade, or I climbed this rank, or whatever it might be, that wasn't a waste of time. So that was good. And I'm going to keep on working toward it. That's pretty much how the logic works for them.
Yeah. And I mean, and sometimes it doesn't mean that it always has to be even about them. Like, it could be like something beneficial for someone else too. Like if, it's like a child. I mean, I'm just saying as like an example, because someone could interpret that as, oh, ETJs are just always like about themselves.
Right.
But yeah, it can have a bigger picture effect too involved.
Yeah.
But yeah, for the most part, yeah, exactly what Denzel said. And I know we're focusing on extrovert thinking because it's the last slide here. So let me move to this other one. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts. We can put the spotlight on a different function. We have 7 minutes. If anyone has any questions about dominant functions and other dominant functions or anything about that. Or if you have any more thoughts, Denzel.
I personally do not. I think though that I might have to hop off.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right. So I'm gonna go ahead and say goodbye. Denzel, before you hop off, do you want to quick let people know how they can reach out to you if they want to get your profiling services?
Absolutely. So yeah, you can reach me at denzelmensa.com. That's where you'll find my services and everything. I give profiling sessions and coaching sessions. And so relationship coaching. So I can help you not only identify what personality type that you are, but I can also help you to become the best version of who you are. I can help you with your relationships with other people, etc. So yeah, denzelmensa.com. If you also search Denzel Mensa on YouTube, you'll find me there. I took a 2-month hiatus and I just came back recently. So yeah, check me out. Thanks for having me again, Susan. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Denzel. Thanks for being here. You always have amazing insights. Thank you. And I noticed Siren of the Void, you said extroverted feeling resonates. I have questioned whether things I said here were wrong somehow. I don't know if you meant here like on the stream or here just in life, but I'm glad that you feel like extroverted feeling like you're maybe understanding a part of your personality better. I don't think from the moments that I've looked over into the chat, I haven't seen anything that you said that was wrong. I think any kind of question you could ask that's, trying to figure yourself out is really difficult. And if you have any questions about these functions, please, this is the time to ask them. And we're more than happy to answer them if we know the answers anyway. All right. So next week, I am out of town. So we are not having a stream next week, but the week after that, we will be talking about the auxiliary function. And that's some people call it the co-pilot. Some people call it the mother-father function. That's the second function in your stack. So if you want to know more about your second function, your auxiliary function, tune in 2 weeks from today, and we will be getting into that. If you'd like to know more about the dominant function or about the cognitive functions, check out my website at psychologyjunkie.com. I actually wrote a post all about the dominant function and how it shows up for all 16 personality types, and I will try to link that in the description for this video. And Siren of the Void, you didn't share anything negative or bad or wrong in the chat today. You're amazing. We want you to be able to feel free to share, and anyone who's watching this, feel free to share. This is supposed to be interactive. And Katya, I think, is echoing that. Thank you, Katya. It can be hard sometimes to express yourself around other people, even me as an INTJ. I mean, half the time I have these live streams and then I lay in bed at night and think, why did I say that thing that way? So it's hard to be human, I think, sometimes. So I'm going to remove these slides, and I don't see any other questions coming through. But if you think of a question after this, go ahead and leave it in the comments. I don't always respond right away, but I will try to respond as soon as I can. You can also shoot me an email at susanstorm@psychologyjunkie.com. Again, I can't always respond right away, but I try to respond as quickly as I can. I run my Psychology Junkie along with having 5 kids, and it's just me. So sometimes I'm making dinner and I don't see a comment come through right away or things like that. But I do care about getting your questions answered. So if you have a question, be sure to leave that in the comments, and I would love to get back to you when I can. Thank you, everyone, who logged on today, who made time to be here. It was really great to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Katya, Siren of the World. Thank you, Flow State. I'm trying to remember Mr. J. Everyone who was part of this, I really appreciate it. And I hear one of my kids knocking on the door, so I'm going to get going. But thank you so much for being part of this. And I will see you all in 2 weeks. Bye, everyone.